The Sinking of the Titanic and Other Great Sea Disasters, edited by Logan Marshall. Other Heroes. Among the chivalrous young heroes of the Titanic disaster were Washington A. Roebling and Howard Case, London representative of the Vacuum Oil Company. Both were urged repeatedly to take places in lifeboats, but scorned the opportunity while working against time to save the women aboard the ill-fated ship. They went to their death, it is said by survivors, with smiles on their faces. Both of these young men aided in the saving of Mrs. William T. Graham, wife of the president of the American Can Company, and Mrs. Graham's 19-year-old daughter, Margaret. Afterwards, relating some of her experiences, Mrs. Graham said, "There was a rap at the door. It was a passenger whom we had met shortly after the ship left Liverpool, and his name was Roebling, Washington A. Roebling. He was a gentleman and a brave man. He warned us of the danger and told us it would be best to be prepared for an emergency. We heeded his warning, and I looked out of my window and saw a great big iceberg facing us. Immediately I knew what had happened, and we lost no time after that to get out into the saloon. In one of the gangways I met an officer of the ship. 'What's the matter?' I asked him. 'We've only burst 2 pipes,' he said. 'Everything is all right, don't worry.' 'But what makes the ship list so?' I asked. 'Oh, that's nothing,' he replied, and walked away. Mr. Case advised us to get into a boat. 'And what are you going to do?' we asked him. 'Oh,' he replied, 'I'll take a chance and stay here.' Just at that time they were filling up the 3rd lifeboat on the port side of the ship. I thought at the time that it was the 3rd boat which had been lowered, but I found out later that they had lowered other boats on the other side, where the people were more excited because they were sinking on that side. Just then Mr. Roebling came up too, and told us to hurry and get into the 3rd boat. Mr. Roebling and Mr. Case bustled our party of 3 into that boat in less time than it takes to tell it. They were both working hard to help the women and children. The boat was fairly crowded when we 3 were pushed into it, and a few men jumped in at the last moment, but Mr. Roebling and Mr. Case stood at the rail and made no attempt to get into the boat. They shouted good-bye to us. What do you think Mr. Case did then? He just calmly lighted a cigarette and waved us good-bye with his hand. Mr. Roebling stood there too. I can see him now. I am sure that he knew that the ship would go to the bottom, but both just stood there. In the face of death. Scenes on the sinking vessel grew more tragic as the remaining passengers faced the awful certainty that death must be the portion of its majority. Death in the darkness of a wintry sea studded with its ice monuments like the marble shafts in some vast cemetery. In that hour, when cherished illusions of possible safety had all but vanished, manhood and womanhood aboard the Titanic rose to their sublimest heights. It was in that crisis of the direst extremity that many brave women deliberately rejected life and chose rather to remain and die with the men whom they loved. Death fails to part Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. "I will not leave my husband," said Mrs. Isidor Strauss. "We are old, we can best die together." And she turned from those who would have forced her into one of the boats, and clung to the man who had been the partner of her joys and sorrows. Thus they stood hand in hand and heart to heart, comforting each other until the sea claimed them, united in death, as they had been through a long life. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. Miss Elizabeth Evans fulfilled this final test of affection laid down by the Divine Master. The girl was the niece of the wife of Magistrate Cornell, of New York. She was placed in the same boat with many other women. As it was about to be lowered away, it was found that the craft contained one more than its full quota of passengers. The grim question arose as to which of them should surrender her place and her chance of safety. Beside Miss Evans sat Mrs. J. Brown of Denver, the mother of several children. Miss Evans was the first to volunteer to yield to another. Girl steps back to doom. "Your need is greater than mine," said she to Mrs. Brown. "You have children who need you, and I have none." So saying, she arose from the boat and stepped back upon the deck. The girl found no later refuge and was one of those who went down with the ship. She was 25 years old and was beloved by all who knew her. Mrs. Brown thereafter showed the spirit which had made her also volunteer to leave the boat. There were only 3 men in the boat, and but one of them rowed. Mrs. Brown, who was raised on the water, immediately picked up one of the heavy sweeps and began to pull. In the boat which carried Mrs. Cornell and Mrs. Appleton there were places for 17 more than were carried. This, too, was undermanned, and the 2 women at once took their places at the oars. The Countess of Rothes was pulling at the oars of her boat, likewise undermanned, because the crew preferred to stay behind. Miss Bentham of Rochester showed splendid courage. She happened to be in a lifeboat which was very much crowded, so much so that one sailor had to sit with his feet dangling in the icy cold water, and as time went on the sufferings of the man from the cold were apparent. Miss Bentham arose from her place and had the man turn around while she took his place with her feet in the water. Scarcely any of the lifeboats were properly manned. 2, filled with women and children, capsized immediately, while the collapsible boats were only temporarily useful. They soon filled with water. In one boat 18 or 20 persons sat in water above their knees for 6 hours. The lifeboats being lowered. In one lifeboat I saw an order for £5, which this man gave to each of the crew of his boat after they got aboard the Carpathia. It was on a piece of ordinary paper addressed to the Coutts Bank of England. We called that boat the money boat. It was lowered from the starboard side, and was one of the first off. Our orders were to load the lifeboats beginning forward on the port side, working aft, and then back on the starboard. This man paid the firemen to lower a starboard boat before the officers had given the order. Whiteley's own experience was a hard one. When the uncoiling rope, which entangled his feet, threw him into the sea, it furrowed the flesh of his leg, but he did not feel the pain until he was safe aboard the Carpathia. "I floated on my life preserver for several hours," he said. "Then I came across a big oak dresser with 2 men clinging on it. I hung on to this till daybreak, and the 2 men dropped off. When the sun came up, I saw the collapsible raft in the distance, just black with men. They were all standing up, and I swam to it, almost a mile, it seemed to me, and they would not let me aboard. Mr. Lightoller, the second officer, was one of them. 'It's 31 lives against yours,' he said. 'You can't come aboard. There's not room.' I pleaded with him in vain, and then I confess I prayed that somebody might die so I could take his place. It was only human. And then someone did die, and they let me aboard. By and by we saw 7 lifeboats lashed together, and we were taken into them." Men shot down. The officers had to assert their authority by force, and 3 foreigners from the steerage who tried to force their way in among the women and children were shot down without mercy. Robert Daniel, a Philadelphia passenger, told of a terrible scene at this period of the disaster. He said men fought and bit and struck one another like madmen, and exhibited wounds upon his face to prove the assertion. Mr. Daniel said that he was picked up naked from the ice-cold water, and had almost perished from exposure before he was rescued. He and others told how the Titanic's bow was completely torn away by the impact with the berg. K. Whiteman, of Palmyra, New Jersey, the Titanic's barber, was lowering boats on the deck after the collision, and declared the officers on the bridge, one of them, First Officer Murdoch, promptly worked the electrical apparatus for closing the watertight compartments. He believed the machinery was in some way damaged by the crash, that the front compartments failed to close tightly, although the rear ones were secure. Whiteman's manner of escape was unique. He was blown off the deck by the second of the 2 explosions of the boilers, and was in the water more than 2 hours before he was picked up by a raft. The explosions, Whiteman said, were caused by the rushing in of the icy water on the boilers. A bundle of deck chairs, roped together, was blown off the deck with me, and I struck my back, injuring my spine, but it served as a temporary raft. The crew and passengers had faith in the bulkhead system to save the ship, and we were lowering a collapsible boat. all confident the ship would get through, when she took a terrific dip forward, and the water swept over the deck and into the engine rooms. The bow went clean down, and I caught the pile of chairs as I was washed up against the rim. Then came the explosions which blew me 15 feet. After the water had filled the forward compartments, the ones at the stern could not save her, although they did delay the ship's going down. If it wasn't for the compartments, hardly anyone could have gotten away. A sad message. One of the Titanic's stewards, Johnson by name, carried this message to the sorrowing widow of Benjamin Guggenheim. When Mr. Guggenheim realized that there was grave danger, said the room steward, he advised his secretary, who also died, to dress fully, and he himself did the same. Mr. Guggenheim, who was cool and collected as he was pulling on his outer garments, said to the steward,